The tension in the congressional hearing room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Candace Owens sat at the witness table, her red blazer standing out against the formal mahogany backdrop. Across from her, Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, preparing to deliver what everyone expected would be another partisan attack. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would shock everyone in that room, and millions watching at home. Owens suddenly stood up, pointing directly at Crockett, her voice rising to a shout that echoed through the chambers. "Wake up! Just wake up and see what you're doing to your own people." The room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in. Security stepped forward. This was the moment everyone thought would explode into chaos. Instead, what followed was the most unexpected response in political history, one that would change hearts and minds across America. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these powerful moments that are reshaping American politics. The live stream was breaking records. Over 2 million people tuned in to watch what was supposed to be a routine congressional hearing about social media regulation. Nobody expected it to become the most watched political confrontation of the year. Candace Owens arrived that morning with a mission. The 34-year-old conservative commentator had built her reputation on fearless confrontations with the political establishment. From her early days challenging liberal orthodoxy to her current status as one of the most influential black conservative voices in America, Owens never backed down from a fight. She wore her signature red blazer, the same color she'd worn when she first testified before Congress 3 years earlier. Her team had briefed her extensively on what to expect, but Owens always preferred to speak from the heart rather than prepared talking points. Sitting across the room, Representative Jasmine Crockett represented everything Owens opposed. The 42-year-old congresswoman from Texas had quickly risen through Democratic ranks with her sharp questioning style and unwavering progressive positions. She was known for her ability to dismantle conservative witnesses with precision legal arguments honed during her years as a civil rights attorney. Crockett had prepared for weeks for this hearing. Her staff had compiled thick briefing books on Owens's past statements, looking for contradictions and vulnerabilities. The plan was simple: expose Owens as a fraud who had sold out her own community for conservative fame and fortune. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. With midterm elections approaching, both parties saw this as a crucial moment to define the narrative around race, social media, and political messaging in America. For Democrats, Owens represented the dangerous spread of conservative influence in black communities. They needed to discredit her before her message reached more people. For Republicans, Owens was proof that their party was welcoming to diverse voices. Her success challenged every Democratic assumption about race and politics in America. But neither side understood what was really at stake. This confrontation would reveal something deeper about the nature of political dialogue in America, and whether it was possible to find common ground across the deepest divides. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Journalists filled the press gallery. Protesters lined the hallways outside, holding signs supporting both women. Social media was already buzzing with predictions about who would emerge victorious. The hearing had been going on for 2 hours. Other witnesses had testified about algorithms, content moderation, and free speech. The questioning had been routine, predictable, boring even. Then Crockett began her questioning of Owens. "Ms. Owens," Crockett began, her voice measured and professional, "you've built your career on telling black Americans that racism isn't a significant factor in their struggles. How do you justify that position when study after study shows persistent racial disparities in employment, healthcare, education, and criminal justice?" Owens leaned into her microphone. "Congresswoman, I've built my career on telling black Americans the truth, that we have more power than the Democratic Party wants us to believe." "The truth?" Crockett's eyebrows raised. "Or a convenient narrative that helps you profit from undermining civil rights progress?" The temperature in the room began to rise. This was the confrontation everyone had been waiting for. Crockett wasn't done. She pulled out a thick folder of documents, the sound of papers rustling amplified by the microphones throughout the chamber. Ms. Owens, I have here transcripts of speeches where you've claimed that slavery's impact on Black Americans was minimal compared to what you call democratic plantation politics. Can you explain how that statement serves the interests of Black families struggling with generational poverty? The audience stirred. Camera phones came out despite strict rules against recording. This was getting personal fast. Owens' jaw tightened. Congresswoman, what doesn't serve Black families is politicians like you who've spent decades promising change while their communities get worse. Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, all run by Democrats for generations. Where's the progress you promised? Ms. Owens, please answer the question I asked. I am answering it. You just don't like the answer. The hearing chairman banged his gavel. The witness will respond to the Congresswoman's specific questions. Crockett leaned forward, her voice taking on a prosecutorial edge she'd perfected in courtrooms. Ms. Owens, let's talk about your income. Public records show you've earned millions from speaking fees, book deals, and media contracts promoting conservative talking points. Isn't it convenient that your awakening to conservative politics coincided with significant financial opportunities? A murmur ran through the crowd. This was crossing into personal territory that most congressional hearings avoided. Owens's hands clenched on the table in front of her. Are you seriously questioning my integrity because I've been successful? Isn't that exactly the kind of thinking that keeps people trapped in poverty? The idea that success somehow makes you a sellout. I'm questioning whether your financial incentives have influenced your messaging in ways that harm the very communities you claim to represent. And I'm questioning whether your political incentives have influenced your messaging in ways that keep those communities dependent on government programs that have failed for 50 years. The back and forth was intensifying. In the press gallery, reporters were frantically typing. On social media, clips were already going viral. Candace vs. Jasmine was trending. Crockett shifted tactics, her voice becoming more emotional. Ms. Owens, I grew up in a community where young Black men were more likely to go to prison than college, where families couldn't get business loans or mortgages despite perfect credit, where schools were underfunded and opportunities were scarce. When I see you dismiss these realities as excuses, it feels like a betrayal of everyone who's fighting those battles. For the first time, Owens paused. The raw emotion in Crockett's voice had hit something deeper than political talking points. Congresswoman, Owens said, her voice softer now, I grew up poor too. I know those struggles are real. But I also know that when we tell young Black kids that the system is rigged against them and they can't succeed without government intervention, we're stealing their power before they even try. And when we tell them that racism doesn't exist, we're stealing their ability to recognize and fight injustice when they encounter it. The philosophical divide was stark and clear. Two successful Black women, both from humble beginnings, with completely opposite views about how to help their communities. The questioning continued for another 20 minutes. With each exchange, the tension ratcheted higher. Crockett presented studies, statistics, and examples of ongoing discrimination. Owens countered with stories of individual success, critiques of democratic policies, and calls for personal responsibility. The audience was captivated, but also increasingly uncomfortable. This felt less like a hearing and more like a family argument being broadcast to the world. Then Crockett made her final move. Ms. Owens, I want to read you something. She pulled out a sheet of paper. This is from a speech you gave last month. Black Americans who vote for Democrats are mentally enslaved to a party that has kept them in chains for decades. How do you think those words sound to the millions of Black Americans who vote Democratic? Because they believe it's the best way to protect their families and communities? Owens's face flushed. I think those words sound like the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. You think 60% of Black Americans are mentally enslaved? I think 60% of Black Americans have been convinced that they can't succeed. Without Democrat politicians, yes. So Black voters who disagree with you are just too stupid or brainwashed to understand their own interests? That was the line. Owens shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That is not what I said, and you know it." The room erupted. Some people stood and applauded. Others booed loudly. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. But Owens wasn't done. She pointed directly at Crockett, her voice rising above the chaos. "Wake up. Just wake up and see what you're doing to your own people. Security guards moved toward Owens, unsure whether to escort her out or let the hearing continue. The chairman's gavel pounded uselessly as the room buzzed with tension and confusion. But then something extraordinary happened. Representative Jasmine Crockett did something nobody expected. Instead of shouting back, instead of demanding Owens be removed, instead of escalating the confrontation, she did the one thing that caught everyone off guard. She took a deep breath, looked directly at Owens, and spoke in a voice so calm and clear that the entire room fell silent to hear it. "Candace," she said, using her first name for the first time, "please sit down. I want to understand what you mean." The shock was palpable. Reporters looked up from their phones. The audience leaned forward. Even Owens seemed stunned by the response. "What?" Owens said, still standing. "Please sit down," Crockett repeated. "You just told me to wake up. I want to know what you think I need to wake up to. But I can't listen if you're shouting at me." Slowly, uncertainly, Owens sat back down. The room remained silent, as if everyone was afraid that any sound might break whatever spell had just been cast. Crockett continued, her voice remaining steady and genuinely curious. "You said I need to wake up and see what I'm doing to my own people. I represent a district that's majority black and Hispanic. These are my neighbors, my friends, people I've known my whole life. If I'm hurting them, I need to know how." Owens blinked, clearly thrown off by the unexpected turn. She had prepared for argument, for confrontation, for the usual political theater. She hadn't prepared for genuine engagement. Owens started, then stopped. "You really want to know?" "I really want to know." For the first time in the entire hearing, Owens's defensive posture softened. Her shoulders relaxed. Her voice lost its edge. "When I was growing up," she began, "every adult in my life told me that I couldn't succeed because I was black. They meant well. They thought they were preparing me for reality. But what they actually did was convince me that trying was pointless." Crockett nodded, listening without interrupting. "It wasn't until someone, a conservative mentor, told me that I had the power to change my circumstances that I actually started believing I could. That's what I mean by wake up. Not that your voters are stupid, but that maybe we're all so focused on fighting the system that we're forgetting to empower people to succeed within it." The room was completely silent now. This wasn't the inflammatory rhetoric everyone expected. This was something deeper, more personal. Crockett leaned back in her chair, considering. "So when you see me fighting for voting rights, for education, funding, for healthcare access, you see that as telling people they can't succeed on their own?" "Sometimes, yes," Owens said honestly. "Because the message that comes through isn't, 'We're fighting to give you opportunities.' It's, 'You need us to fight for you because you can't do it yourself.'" Something shifted in the room. The angry energy that had been building for hours began to transform into something else. Curiosity, perhaps even understanding. In the gallery, people who had come to watch a political bloodsport were witnessing something they'd never seen before. Two politicians having an actual conversation about their differences instead of just scoring points. Crockett nodded slowly. "I can see how that message could be discouraging. But when I look at my district, I see people who are working 2 and 3 jobs and still can't afford health care. I see kids who are brilliant but can't access quality education because of where they were born. Those aren't failures of individual effort. Those are systemic barriers. But how do we remove those barriers without also removing people's sense of agency?" Owens asked. "Because I've seen too many programs that were designed to help, but ended up creating dependency instead." For the first time, Crockett smiled slightly. "That's actually a really good question. And maybe that's where we need to focus. Not on whether problems exist, but on how we solve them in ways that empower people instead of just helping them. The transformation wasn't just happening between Owens and Crockett. It was spreading through the entire room. In the audience, people who had come to cheer for their side were actually listening to the other perspective. Republicans were nodding, as Crockett explained the reality of systemic barriers. Democrats were considering Owens' points about empowerment and agency. On social media, the tone was changing too. Instead of the usual partisan attacks, people were sharing quotes from both women and actually engaging with the ideas instead of just the conflict. The hearing chairman, who had been preparing to end the session due to disorder, instead found himself fascinated by the conversation unfolding before him. "Ms. Owens," Crockett continued, "what would it look like to fight systemic barriers while also empowering individual agency?" Owens thought for a moment. "Maybe instead of just funding programs, we fund results. Instead of just giving people assistance, we give them paths to ownership. Instead of just fighting discrimination, we build economic power that makes discrimination irrelevant." Those aren't mutually exclusive goals, Crockett realized aloud. We could expand access to business loans and also fight lending discrimination. We could improve schools and also promote school choice. We could strengthen safety nets and also create pathways to independence. The room was witnessing something unprecedented. Two political opponents finding common ground in real time. Owens looked at Crockett with something approaching respect. "You know what? I think I misjudged you. I came here thinking you were just another politician using race to gain power. But you actually care about outcomes, not just ideology." Crockett returned the look. "And I misjudged you too. I thought you were just a provocateur saying controversial things for attention. But you're actually trying to solve the same problems." "I am, just from a different angle." The audience was transfixed. Many were recording on their phones despite the rules, knowing they were witnessing something historic. "What if," Crockett said slowly, "instead of debating whether systemic racism exists or whether personal responsibility matters, we focused on creating solutions that address both?" "What would that even look like?" Owens asked. "I don't know," Crockett admitted. "But maybe that's a conversation worth having." As the hearing concluded, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual partisan reactions, both sides seemed genuinely moved by what they had witnessed. The audience didn't rush for the exits. They lingered, talking quietly among themselves, processing what they had just seen. Republicans and Democrats were actually talking to each other, instead of just talking past each other. In the press gallery, reporters struggled to write their stories. The usual narrative of political combat didn't fit what had just happened. How do you describe a confrontation that turned into collaboration? Social media exploded, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of "Candace destroys Jasmine" or "Jasmine puts down Candace," the trending hashtags were "common ground" and "real conversation." Within hours, clips from the hearing were everywhere. But it wasn't the shouting moment that went viral. It was Crockett's calm response in the conversation that followed. A Twitter user with 500,000 followers posted, "I came here to watch these two destroy each other. Instead, I watched them find ways to work together. This is what politics should look like." The video of Crockett saying, "Please sit down, I want to understand what you mean," was shared over 100,000 times in the first hour, with comments like, "This is how you de-escalate conflict." Why can't all politicians talk to each other like this? Jasmine Crockett just showed us what leadership looks like. But Owens was getting praise too. Her willingness to soften her approach and engage genuinely was resonating with people tired of performative politics. Candace showed real courage by dropping the act and speaking honestly. This is what happens when people actually listen to each other. Both of these women just elevated the entire political conversation. News networks struggled to cover the story. Their standard frameworks of political conflict didn't apply. Pundits who had prepared for a typical partisan battle found themselves discussing something entirely different. A primetime news anchor admitted on air, I've been covering politics for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Two politicians who disagree fundamentally found a way to have a productive conversation. It shouldn't be remarkable, but somehow it is. Opinion writers across the political spectrum found themselves reassessing their own approaches. Conservative. Columnists praised Owens for her authenticity, but also acknowledged Crockett's skill in de-escalating the situation. Liberal writers celebrated Crockett's leadership while also recognizing the validity of some of Owens's concerns. Within days, something extraordinary began happening in Washington. Other politicians started referencing the Owens-Crockett hearing as a model for how political discourse should work. A Republican senator tweeted, "Watched a Candace Owens and Jasmine Crockett show us that you can disagree passionately without being disagreeable. We should all take notes." A Democratic representative posted, "Real leadership isn't about winning arguments. It's about finding solutions. Thank you, Jasmine Crockett, for showing us how it's done." But the impact went beyond social media praise. Behind the scenes, conversations were starting between politicians who had never spoken before. Staff members who had been instructed to avoid bipartisan cooperation were suddenly being asked to explore areas of common ground. 2 weeks after the hearing, something unprecedented happened. Owens and Crockett announced they were co-authoring an opinion piece about criminal justice reform, specifically about how to reduce incarceration rates while also addressing community safety concerns. The piece, published in a major newspaper, laid out a framework that combined conservative principles of personal responsibility and free market solutions with progressive goals of systemic reform and social justice. "We still disagree on many things," they wrote, "but we've discovered that our disagreements are often about means, not ends. We both want safe communities, economic opportunity, quality education, and equal justice. The question isn't whether these goals are worth pursuing, it's how to achieve them most effectively." The op-ed was shared more widely than any political piece published that year. Comments ranged from skeptical to hopeful to inspired. The Owens-Crockett model began spreading beyond politics. Business leaders started referencing it in discussions about workplace conflict resolution. Teachers began using clips from the hearing to show students how to engage with people who disagree with them. Universities started hosting Owens-Crockett-style debates where participants were required to find at least one point of agreement with their opponents. Marriage counselors began recommending the hearing to couples struggling with conflict, particularly the moment when Crockett chose de-escalation over confrontation. But perhaps most importantly, the hearing began changing how ordinary Americans talk to each other about politics. At dinner tables across the country, family members who had stopped discussing politics began tentatively reopening those conversations, using the hearing as a model for how to engage productively across differences. Online forums that had been toxic battlegrounds began implementing Crockett rules, requirements to acknowledge valid points from the other side before making counter-arguments. Local. Political groups started hosting joint events where Republicans and Democrats could discuss issues using the collaborative approach modeled by Owens and Crockett. 6 months later, polling showed that Americans' trust in political institutions had increased for the first time in over a decade. When asked why, the most common response referenced politicians acting more like Candace Owens and Jasmine Crockett. Both women saw their approval ratings rise across party lines. Owens gained respect among Democrats for her willingness to engage authentically. Crockett gained admiration from Republicans for her leadership in de-escalating conflict. More importantly, they had demonstrated that political opponents could disagree fundamentally while still treating each other with respect and working together on shared goals. The Owens-Crockett hearing became a case study in conflict resolution taught in schools, businesses, and government training programs across the country. Communication experts, psychologists, and political scientists analyzed the exchange extensively and identified several key principles that emerged from their interaction. Universities began incorporating the hearing into their curriculum for law students, business majors, and psychology programs, with professors using frame-by-frame analysis to demonstrate the precise moments when the interaction shifted from destructive to constructive. Corporate training programs adopted elements of the exchange for executive leadership development, while military academies used it to teach negotiation tactics in high-stakes environments. De-escalation proved far more powerful than escalation, as Crockett's calm response to Owens's shouting immediately shifted the entire dynamic of their confrontation. Rather than matching aggression with aggression, her measured approach created space for genuine dialogue where none had existed before. This technique, now known in academic circles as the Crockett method, demonstrates how lowering your voice, when someone raises theirs, can actually command more attention and respect than responding with equal volume. Neuroscientists studying the footage noted how Crockett's calm demeanor triggered what they called a mirror response in Owens, where the brain naturally begins to match the emotional tone of the person speaking. This biological response explained why shouting matches tend to escalate while calm responses tend to de-escalate, providing scientific backing for what many had observed intuitively. Emergency responders began incorporating these techniques into their training for dealing with agitated individuals, while customer service departments found that employees trained in the Crockett method experienced significantly fewer confrontational encounters. Curiosity demonstrated greater effectiveness than certainty, with Crockett's willingness to ask, "What do you mean?" opening pathways to understanding that rigid positions would have closed off completely. This approach challenged the traditional political playbook of never showing uncertainty or admitting gaps in knowledge. Instead, Crockett's intellectual humility became a source of strength, allowing her to learn her opponent's perspective while simultaneously teaching the audience. Behavioral psychologists noted that when people feel genuinely heard and understood, they become more willing to listen in return, creating what researchers called a reciprocal engagement cycle. This phenomenon explained why the conversation became increasingly productive, as both participants demonstrated genuine interest in understanding each other's viewpoints. Educational institutions began teaching this principle as fundamental to critical thinking, encouraging students to approach disagreements with questions rather than statements, fostering environments where learning could occur across ideological boundaries. The hearing also revealed that listening creates more influence than shouting, as the audience became more engaged and receptive once the volume decreased and the substance increased. Body language experts noted how the entire room's posture changed when both women began genuinely listening to each other, with crossed arms unfolding and defensive positions softening throughout the chamber. Acoustic analysis of the room showed that background noise levels dropped significantly during the collaborative portion of the exchange, with even whispered conversations stopping as people strained to hear every word of the substantive discussion. Media consultants studying the phenomenon discovered that viewer engagement actually increased during the quieter moments, contradicting conventional wisdom that conflict drives attention. Perhaps most surprisingly, the exchange showed that common ground exists even in the deepest disagreements, with both women discovering shared goals despite their vastly different approaches to achieving them. This revelation challenged the zero-sum mentality that had dominated political discourse for decades. Conflict resolution specialists identified this as a classic example of moving from positional bargaining to interest-based negotiation, where parties focus on underlying needs rather than stated demands. The transformation demonstrated that what appear to be irreconcilable differences often mask shared values and compatible objectives. International diplomats began referencing the hearing in peace negotiations, using it as proof that even seemingly intractable conflicts could find breakthrough moments through proper facilitation and genuine engagement. Personal attacks, which had dominated the early portion of their interaction, clearly prevented productive engagement, and only began to dissolve when both participants moved away from character assassination toward policy discussion. Communication. Researchers documented how personal attacks trigger defensive responses that shut down the parts of the brain responsible for processing new information and considering alternative perspectives. Finally, Vulnerability and authenticity proved capable of breaking through defensive barriers that had seemed impenetrable, with Owens' admission of her own experiences and Crockett's acknowledgement of potential blind spots creating the foundation for genuine connection across ideological divides. Trust-building experts noted that when public figures show genuine vulnerability, it humanizes them and makes their positions more relatable, even to those who disagree with their conclusions. For Owens, the experience led to a subtle but meaningful evolution in her approach. While she maintained her conservative principles, she began incorporating more nuance into her messaging and showing greater willingness to acknowledge the complexity of social issues. "I realized that you can believe in personal responsibility while also recognizing systemic barriers," she said in a later interview. "The goal isn't to choose one or the other, it's to address both." For Crockett, the hearing reinforced her belief in the power of genuine engagement across differences. "I could have scored political points by attacking Candace when she stood up and shouted," she reflected. "But what would that have accomplished? Instead, we found a way to actually move the conversation forward." A year later, Owens and Crockett announced they were launching a joint initiative focused on criminal justice reform, education policy, and economic development in underserved communities. "We still disagree on plenty," Crockett said at the announcement. "But we've learned that our disagreements make us stronger, not weaker. When you combine different perspectives, you get better solutions." Owens nodded in agreement. "The problems facing America are too big for any one ideology to solve alone. If we want real change, we need to work together." The Owens-Crockett model continued spreading through American political culture. Presidential candidates began referencing it in debates. Congressional leaders started implementing similar approaches in committee hearings. Local politicians across the country adopted their methods for town halls and public forums. Most importantly, ordinary Americans began believing again that political disagreement didn't have to mean personal animosity, that people with different views could work together for common goals, and that democracy could function even in a polarized society. The hearing that began with Candace Owens shouting, "Wake up," at Jasmine Crockett ended up waking up an entire country to the possibility that political discourse could be both passionate and productive, both principled and collaborative. As we reflect on this remarkable moment in American politics, the lesson is clear. Sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is not aggression in return, but the courage to listen, understand, and find common ground. Jasmine Crockett showed us that true strength isn't about winning arguments, it's about solving problems. And Candace Owens demonstrated that authenticity and vulnerability can be more persuasive than any talking points. Together they proved that even in our most divided times, Americans can still find ways to work together for the common good. But did you think of this incredible moment? Do you believe this kind of political dialogue is possible in today's climate? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the moments that are reshaping American politics. The conversation doesn't end here, it's just beginning.